Awakening on Main Street, Chapter 2, Broken Strings and Mended Hearts. Maya Chen woke to the sound of rain against her apartment windows, each drop, creating momentary prisms that fractured the early morning light into tiny rainbows before dissolving back into ordinary water. She lay still for several minutes, listening to the city's awakening symphony, distant traffic humming like a mechanical mantra, the rhythmic clatter of an early delivery truck, the muffled conversations of neighbors beginning their daily routines. But beneath these familiar urban sounds, she heard something else, a frequency that seemed to pulse in harmony with her own heartbeat, as if the city itself had learned to breathe in rhythm with her consciousness. 3 months had passed since the stranger's departure, 3 months since those extraordinary encounters that had awakened something profound in her understanding of what music could be and do. The violin case beside her bed remained closed, not from neglect, but from a growing uncertainty that felt both terrifying and sacred. Each morning brought the same question that seemed to rise from some depth she had never acknowledged before. What if the music that wanted to emerge through her was too powerful, too transformative, too risky to release into the world? She rose slowly, her body carrying the familiar ache of someone who had been dreaming intensely, dreams filled with melodies and that existed in colors that had no names for, and harmonies that seemed to bridge worlds that couldn't quite remember. She couldn't quite remember upon her waking. Her small studio apartment felt different now, charged with possibilities that made the walls seem more confining and more spacious than before. The morning light streaming through rain-streaked windows created moving patterns on the floor that reminded her of the musical notation, as if the universe itself was composing something she wasn't meant to learn to read. Maya moved through her morning routine with the careful attention the stranger had somehow taught her to bring to ordinary activities. Brushing her teeth became a meditation on the relationship between rhythm and consciousness, the circular motions connecting her to her cycles within cycles, personal to cosmic. Making tea involved listening not just to the kettle's whistle, but to the more subtle sounds of water transforming from one state to another. Steam carrying microscopic melodies that spoke of change and possibility. As she waited for the tea to steep, memories of her grandmother's voice drifted through her consciousness, speaking in the Mandarin that had been their secret language, their bridge between the cultural expectations of Maya's American-born identity and the deeper roots that stretched back through generations of musicians and storytellers. Music is the language before language, her grandmother had often said, the sound that exists between heartbeats and the silence that gives notes their meaning. Maya had understood these words intellectually for years, but now they resonated in her body with a visceral truth that made her chest tighten with recognition and loss. Her phone buzzed with the kind of notification that had become routine since her awakening began. Opportunities that seemed too perfectly aligned with her emerging capabilities to be coincidental. This morning's message came from a talent scout representing a music production company specializing in wellness soundtracks and therapeutic audio experiences. They had somehow discovered recordings of her street performances and were interested in discussing commercial applications for your unique approach to consciousness-based composition. Maya stared at the screen, feeling her stomach contract with a mixture of recognition and revulsion. The vocabulary itself, quote, commercial applications, quote, therapeutic audio experiences, end quote. They all seemed designed to strip away everything that made her musical evolution meaningful, while preserving only the surface effects that could be packaged and sold. She deleted the message without responding, but the encounter left her feeling exposed, as if the forces that she couldn't see were monitoring her development for purposes she couldn't trust. The catalyst that would define her day arrived not as dramatic crisis, but as quiet revelation. the most genuine transformations began. Maya decided to visit the Meridian Cafe, not because she needed caffeine, but because she felt drawn to the space where her awakenings had first taken conscious form. The cafe represented a kind of sacred geography in her internal landscape, a place where ordinary world had revealed its hidden dimensions through the stranger's presence and Joe's transformed approach to service. She walked through the streets that seemed simultaneously familiar and foreign, her awareness heightened to the point where she could perceive layers of sound that usually remained below conscious recognition. The city hummed with frequencies that corresponded to different states of human consciousness. The anxious staccato rhythms of people rushing to obligations they resented, the softer melodies of those who had learned to find moments of peace within the urban chaos, the discordant harmonies of collective stress and individual resistance creating complex polyrhythms. Meridian Cafe buzzed with its usual morning energy, but Maya noticed immediately that something had shifted in the acoustic environment. Joe's presence behind the counter created what she could only describe as a field of conscious attention that affected the sound quality of the entire space. Conversations seemed more authentic, laughter carried deeper resonances, even the espresso machine's mechanical rhythms had taken on a more musical quality. Maya, Joe called out, his voice carrying genuine warmth rather than the professional politeness. The usual? He had somehow learned to remember not just her beverage preferences, but the underlying intentions behind her orders, ordering not just caffeine, but whatever form of nourishment her current state most needed. Something different today, she found herself saying, though she hadn't planned to deviate from routine. Something that matches what I'm feeling, but I don't know how to express yet. Joe paused in his preparation, his attention turning inward toward the quality of listening that had become his signature since the stranger's visit. Maya watched him work with the ingredients that she couldn't identify, movements that looked like conventional coffee preparation but carried the unmistakable intention of someone crafting medicine for the soul rather than just stimulation for the body. When he handed her the cup, the liquid inside bore no resemblance to any beverage she had encountered. It seemed to contain light itself, shifting between colors that corresponded to different emotional states, radiating warmth that penetrated deeper than physical temperature. The first sip represented reverberations throughout her entire nervous system, awakening capacities from perception that she had felt dormant but hadn't known how to access. "How did you know?" she asked, referring not just to the drink, but to the way it addressed needs that she hadn't been able to articulate. "I listened," Joe replied, his simple answer carrying depths of meaning that spoke of months spent learning to hear what people needed rather than just what they requested. The same way you listen when you play music that heals rather than just entertains. Maya felt tears she hadn't expected, not from the sadness, but from recognition that in that moment, she understood that Joe had become a kind of musician himself, using coffee preparation as his instrument for creating harmony between the human needs and cosmic nourishment. His willingness to transform his work into conscious service provided a template for what her own musical evolution might become if she found the courage to risk full expression. As she found a corner table and began to drink what Joe had prepared, Maya felt the familiar internal conflict that had been intensifying for weeks. Part of her consciousness yearned to explore the mystical territories that had opened since her awakening began, compositions that seemed to exist at the intersection of sound and consciousness, melodies that could facilitate healing and transformation in listeners who were ready for exactly such experiences. But another part of her remained terrified of the responsibility that would come with possessing such capabilities, afraid of that the visibility would attract unwanted attention, afraid the cultural expectations that would seek to define and limit what her music meant and what she was allowed to be. The fear had roots that reached deep into her personal history, connecting to memories of being the only Asian face in a predominantly white musical context, or having her artistic choices interpreted through cultural stereotypes rather than individual intention of feeling perpetually caught between honoring her heritage and transcending the limitations others wanted to impose based on their assumptions about what Chinese American music should sound like. But now the stakes felt infinitely higher. The music that wanted to emerge through her didn't fit any conventional categories, Eastern or Western. It seemed to arise from sources that transcended cultural boundaries while somehow honoring all the cultural traditions as expressions of the same fundamental human longing for connection and transcendence. The universality felt both liberating and terrifying, offering freedom from limiting definitions while demanding that she develop entirely new vocabulary for describing what she was creating and why it mattered. Maya opened her violin case for the first time in several days, feeling the familiar thrill of anticipation mixed with the newer sensation of approaching something sacred that required proper preparation and intention. The instrument the instrument seemed to vibrate with potential energy before she lifted it, as if it too had been evolving during their separation, developing capacities that matched her expanding awareness. She began with scales, not the mechanical exercises she had learned in music school, but patterns that seemed designed to attune her nervous system to frequencies that existed between conventional notes, microtonal intervals that created space for emotions and experiences that standard tuning couldn't accommodate. As her fingers found these new relationships between sound and silence, Maya felt her consciousness expanding to encompass not just the cafe's acoustic environment, but the entire urban soundscape that stretched beyond the windows. The music that emerged defied every category she had ever learned to recognize. It wasn't classical or jazz or folk or contemporary composition, but something that seemed to draw from all the traditions belonging fully to none. The melodies created bridges between different states of consciousness, helping listeners transition from ordinary awareness to the kind of expanded perception that made transformation possible. The rhythm seemed to synchronize with natural cycles that existed below conscious recognition, heartbeat and breath and brain waves finding harmonic relationships that enhanced rather than overwhelmed individual nervous system functioning. Other customers in the cafe began to respond in ways that surprised Maya as much as them. Conversations that had been tense or superficial shifted towards greater authenticity and connection. People who had been frantically checking phones found themselves setting devices aside and actually listening to each other with unprecedented attention. The woman at the corner table who had been quietly crying into her coffee began to smile, not with artificial cheerfulness, but with the genuine relief of someone whose grief was being witnessed and honored rather than ignored and dismissed. Elena Rodriguez entered the cafe during this musical transformation, her scientist awareness immediately detecting the unusual atmospheric changes that Maya's playing was creating. She approached the corner where Maya sat with her violin, not to interrupt, but to observe with the careful attention of someone studying a phenomenon that challenged conventional understanding of how consciousness and acoustic environment influenced each other. "What you're doing," Elena said quietly during a pause in Maya's playing, "is creating immeasurable changes in energy patterns of everyone in this space. I can't explain it with current scientific vocabulary, but something is happening here that goes beyond ordinary musical performance." Maya felt her stomach clench with the familiar fear of being studied, categorized, reduced to data points that missed the essential mystery of what made the music meaningful. "I'm not trying to create effects," she said in a voice carrying defensive tension that she wished she could hide, "but I'm playing what wants to be played." "I know," Elena replied, her tone carrying reassurance rather than clinical detachment. "That's exactly what makes it so remarkable. You're not manipulating anything or anyone. You're creating space for something to emerge that serves everyone's highest good, including your own." The words struck Maya like a revelation, revealing an aspect of her musical development that She had been too frightened to acknowledge directly. She wasn't imposing her will on acoustic materials to create predetermined effects. Instead, she was learning to become so attuned to the needs and possibilities present at any given moment that music could emerge through her that served the collective good in ways that transcended individual attention or understanding. This recognition brought both relief and terror. Relief because it meant that she wasn't responsible for controlling outcomes she couldn't possibly predict or manage. Terror because it meant surrendering to a creative process that was larger than her personal identity, accepting a role as servant to forces that operated according to laws she was only beginning to glimpse. Leo Thompson arrived at the cafe as Maya was processing this realization, his artist eye immediately perceiving the visual dimensions of the transformation of her music that it was facilitating. He could see patterns of energy and connecting forms between people that resembled the sacred geometry he had been exploring in his own work, networks of relationship and mutual support that strengthened rather than depleted individual resources. Your music is doing what my art is supposed to do, he told Maya, settling into a chair near her corner table, creating space for people to remember who they really are underneath all the roles and expectations they carry around. Maya felt a flutter of recognition and hope. What if who we really are is too much for the world to handle? What if the music that wants to come through is too powerful or too strange or too challenging? Leo's smile carried the hard-won wisdom of someone who had wrestled with similar fears about his own creative evolution. Then maybe the world needs to expand its capacity to handle more truth, more beauty, more reality. Maybe that's exactly why the music wants to come through you now. Tariq al-Rashad, he joined in their informal gathering, his comedian sensitivity to group dynamics immediately recognizing the unusual quality of connection and openness that had developed in Maya's corner of the cafe. His presence added an element of playful wisdom that helped balance the intensity of the recognition Maya was experiencing. You know what I love about music, Tariq said, his voice carrying the warm humor that had become his signature since his own awakening began. It's only universal language that only gets more specific and more universal the more universal it becomes. The more personal expression somehow touches everyone. The comment resonated through Maya's consciousness like a tuning fork struck at precisely the right frequency. She understood suddenly that her fear of cultural categorization had been based on a misunderstanding of how authentic artistic expression actually functioned. The more deeply she accessed her genuine creative source, the less relevant external categories became. True universality emerged not from avoiding cultural specificity, but from diving so deeply into authentic personal expression that individual truth revealed its connection to universal truth. With this recognition, Maya felt something shift in her relationship to her own musical development. She didn't fear, or the fear didn't disappear entirely, but it transformed from paralyzing terror into appropriate respect for the responsibility that came with serving as a channel for healing frequencies. She was being invited to participate in something larger than personal artistic achievement, something that could contribute to the collective awakening that seemed to be accelerating in their urban community. I think I'm ready to stop hiding from what my music is becoming, Maya said, her voice carrying a quality of commitment that surprised her with its firmness. I don't know how to prepare for the visibility that might come with full expression. Joe approached their table carrying a tray of beverages he had prepared specifically for each person present, drinks that seemed designed to support whatever transformation was occurring in their group dynamic. Maybe preparation isn't about getting ready for something that might happen, he suggested as he distributed the cups. Maybe it's about becoming so authentic in this moment that whatever emerges feels like a natural extension of who you already are. Maya lifted her violin again. This time her approach carried a quality of surrender that allowed music to emerge, that surprised even her with its depth and power. The melodies that flowed through her created harmonic bridges between cultural traditions that lived in her heritage and expanded consciousness techniques that she had been learning since her awakening began. Chinese folk themes wove together with contemporary sound healing approaches, creating compositions that honored ancestral wisdom while serving present moment needs. The transformation in the cafe's atmosphere became unmistakable. Conversations acquired depths of authenticity that most of the customers had never experienced in public spaces. Strangers began making eye contact and exchanging genuine smiles rather than polite acknowledgments. The background tensions that typically characterized urban environments dissolved into something that resembled the feeling of being welcomed into an extended family gathering. Elena documented these changes with the careful attention of a researcher studying phenomena that could revolutionize understanding of how consciousness and environmental influenced each other. But the scientific observation was balanced by personal participation in the healing that Maya's music was facilitating, allowing her to experience the effects from both objects and subjective perspectives. What you're creating, Elena told Maya during another pause in the music, is demonstrable evidence that consciousness and acoustic environment can work together to support collective well-being in ways that mainstream science doesn't have language for yet. Maya felt the familiar tension between wanting recognition for her musical development and fearing the kind of scientific scrutiny that might reduce living mystery to mechanical processes. I don't want to be studied, she said, her honesty carrying vulnerability that deepened the authenticity of their group connection. I want to be understood, but not dissected. The best science serves mystery rather than solving it, Elena replied, her voice carrying the wisdom that she had gained from her own integration of rational and intuitive ways of knowing. What if documentation could protect and support your work rather than explaining it away? The possibility Elena offered felt revolutionary to Maya, suggesting forms of collaboration between artistic and scientific approaches that could strengthen rather than diminish the mystery and power of consciousness-based creative expression. Instead of having her musical evolution analyzed and categorized by external authorities, she could participate in documenting its effects in ways that honed both the precision of scientific method and the irreducible mystery of how healing actually occurred. As the afternoon progressed, Maya found herself moving into increased experimental territory, allowing melodies to emerge that challenged every assumption she'd held about what violin music could sound like or accomplish. The instrument seemed to develop new capabilities in response to her expanding willingness to serve as a conduit for frequencies that existed in the intersection of sound and consciousness. The other customers in the cafe began to organize themselves into configurations that resembled audience for a concert, but the essential difference that every presence felt like participants rather than passive consumers. Maya's music created space for a collective healing work that benefited everyone involved, transforming the commercial coffee shop into something that resembled a contemporary temple or healing center. This is what I was afraid of, Maya confessed to her friends during a break in the music. And what I've been longing for, the responsibility of holding space for another people's transformation. Maybe the fear of the longing are points toward the same thing. Maybe the fear and the longing are pointing toward the same thing, Tariq suggested, his comedian's wisdom finding humor in the paradoxes that characterized all authentic spiritual development. The terror of becoming who you actually are instead of who you thought you were supposed to be. Leo had been sketching throughout Maya's performance, creating visual documentation of the energy patterns and relational configurations that are music facilitated. His artistic record captured not just what was happening, but how it felt to be part of a collective experience that transcended ordinary social boundaries while respecting individual autonomy and choice. Your music is creating what my art is trying to create, Leo told Maya, showing her sketches that captured the sacred geometry of human connection and mutual support. Spaces where people can remember their capacity for authenticity and compassion without having to perform or pretend to protect themselves from each other. Maya studied Leo's work with growing amazement, seeking visual confirmation of experiences she had been feeling but couldn't adequately describe in words. The sketches revealed how her musical expression was creating fields of coherence and harmony that supported individual nervous system regulation while facilitating group consciousness development. I think I understand now why this feels so scary, Maya said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had made an important discovery about their own psychology. It's not just performing music. I'm participating in something that could change how people relate to each other and themselves. Joe approached their table with another round of his consciousness-enhanced beverages, drinks that seemed designed to support whatever level of transformation each person was ready to integrate. Maybe that's exactly why the music wants to come through you, he said, his service-orientated wisdom offering perspective that helped Maya's fears into broader context. Because you care enough about the responsibility to handle it consciously. As evening approached, Maya realized that something fundamental had shifted in her relationship to her own musical development. The fear had disappeared, but it had transformed from paralyzing self-doubt into appropriate respect for the power and responsibility that came with serving as a conduit for healing frequencies. She was ready to stop hiding from the fullness of what her music had become, or could become, and ready to accept the visibility and vulnerability that authentic expression required. I want to start performing publicly again, Maya announced to her friends, her commitment carrying a quality of courage that impressed her as much as them, but not as entertainment, as service, as medicine, as whatever someone wants to emerge when music becomes the bridge between who we think we are and who we actually have the potential to become. Elena immediately offered to document the effects of Maya's public performances, creating scientific records that could help other researchers understand how conscious-based artistic expression influenced collective well-being. Leo volunteered to create visual documentation that could capture the aesthetic and energetic dimensions of the transformation Maya's music facilitated. Tariq suggested comedy performances that could prepare audiences for the kind of expanded awareness that Maya's music required, using humor to dissolve the psychological defenses that prevented deep listening. Joe offered Meridian Cafe as a regular venue for Maya's musical evolution, understanding that his own transformation of coffee service had prepared the space to support consciousness-based artistic expression. But what if it changes everything, Maya asked, voicing the final layer of resistance she felt to full commitment to her musical calling. What if I become someone completely different from who I thought I was? What if that's exactly the point? Tariq replied, his laughter carrying the profound humor of someone who had learned to find joy in the constant surprise of authentic spiritual development. What if the person you thought you were was always just a costume you wore while learning to become who you actually are? Maya felt laughter bubbling up from depths that she hadn't known existed, laughter that harmonized with the frequencies she'd been accessing through her musical evolution. The fear that had dominated her consciousness for months transformed into anticipation, terror alchemized into excitement about possibilities she could imagine but couldn't control. She lifted her violin for one final piece. But this time her approach carried the commitment and authority of someone who had accepted their calling fully. The music that emerged seemed to arise from sources that transcended individual identity while honoring everything unique and precious about her personal history, heritage, and aspirations. Chinese melodies wove together with contemporary consciousness techniques, creating compositions that celebrated cultural specificity while serving universal human needs for connection, healing, and transcendence. As the last notes faded into silence, Maya felt the profound satisfaction that comes from aligning personal expression with authentic purpose. She had found the courage to stop hiding from her own potential, accepting the responsibility and opportunity that came with serving as a bridge between ordinary consciousness and the expanded awareness that made individual and collective transformation possible. The conversation that followed carried the charged quality of authentic communication between people who had witnessed something sacred emerge through collaborative openness and mutual support. They made plans for regular gatherings that would support Maya's musical development while creating opportunities for community healing and consciousness exploration. Maya packed her violin with care and acknowledged the instrument as her partner in work that served purposes larger than personal artistic achievement. As she prepared to leave the cafe, she felt grateful for the friends who had witnessed and supported her breakthrough, grateful for the courage that had emerged when she stopped trying to control outcomes and started to trust the process of authentic expression. Walking home through the streets that seemed to shimmer with new possibilities, Maya carried within her knowledge that she had crossed a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. She was no longer a musician exploring the relationship between sound and consciousness. She had become a servant of the healing frequencies that could emerge when someone developed the courage and the skill to offer their unique gifts fully to the collective awakening that was accelerating throughout their urban community. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities to demonstrate what became possible when someone stopped hiding from their own potential and started serving the evolution of human consciousness. But tonight, Maya fell asleep to the sound of rain, creating new rhythms against her window, melodies that seemed to carry promises of transformation. She was finally ready to accept and explore. Hi, welcome back. Week 8 in Mark's headroom. Gonna make myself real uncomfortable here. I'm not prepared. Well, I am prepared, but if you've been watching the last few hours that I've been presenting on the 5th day of my fast, you get the gist of where I'm coming from. Trying to lay it out here and kind of find what happens, make this an experimental space where it's not preformed to meet some deliverable or entertainment or education, but just sharing and trying to connect authentically with others who are of like-minded thinking. So I did make a list this week of things that I thought were observations that just kind of popped into my head, and I kept a running list of those. So let me go through that list to start off with here. And then I'll show some conclusions that as I submitted that list to some AI to try to get to bounce them off of a obviously a mechanical perspective of what's going on with Mark and maybe relative to what's happening in the world. I'll share some of that feedback with you toward the end. But some interesting notes that I came up with here this week. And by the way, I've started recently to publish on Kindle or Amazon Direct. I've got about 20 books that I've written, and I'm beginning to publish those and release those for the public. I may actually hand a few to people that are around me, and they're available in ebook and in paperback form. They're, I think, maybe $5 or $6 for the ebook and 12 for the paperback. And I think about 7 of them are available right now. My initial intention was to put about 5 out and let those kind of soak in the collective consciousness, so to speak, and just see if anybody was reading and what kind of audience and feedback I got from those, and then release another 5. But as until I get all 20 produced, I think they'll all be available out there on KDP for purchase. And I'm giving away quite a few. I'm learning about marketing, and since I'm not driven to make money, although I'd love to find some support for this channel and for other of the endeavors that I pursue, that's an opportunity to give back if you feel so inclined and you're able. But I'm more inclined to try to find ways to give them away to the right people if I can find the right people around me, and or have some people reach out on through this medium and find ways to basically to get the information out there through these books, which it sounds like I don't characterize my own my own work very very well, but it looks like the feedback is that it's kind of an exploration of consciousness, and through that consciousness, it gives you perspective on your individual role, and maybe as you develop your own understanding of your individual self, you kind of see some purpose and meaning in your life, but that is an iterative process with your environment and what's going on in the world, your community, the larger, perspective of your community to the maybe state or country, and then, some kind of global trend. But that's kind of the perspective of the entire 20 book process is the totalitarian perspective, but it starts small and with an individual awakening. And the series is called The Awakening Chronicles. And so I've got the first 7 books out there, and I'll probably, by next week, I might have all 20 out there. It's a little bit of a mechanical process of getting them prepped and loaded up into KDP and through their process. It's pretty simple, pretty easy, but that might be an interesting And you might actually enjoy some of the stories that I have woven into or from much of the spiritual and the development work that I've been doing on myself over my lifetime. So one of the first notes I had here is about identity through affiliation. If any of you have ever been part of an organization and maybe a profession and been part of a big company, there's a perception that you have in the community and with everyone around you that kind of bleeds into an identity. And it may be an identity that you just kind of hop on, and because you're a member of X organization, you kind of enjoy some of the benefits of that. And that gets blurred into a sense of safety and security and being known throughout your community or your lifestyle, however, you're recognized. Like I know some people at the gym that used to work for IBM, and that does kind of characterize their social group and their kind of their function in as being, semi-smart, people that were involved with a large company that, for the most part, was on the kind of the cutting edge back in its day of delivering technological solutions to businesses. And they have a certain culture around them, and um, they continue to operate that way. And I think some of these people may be retired and enjoying the lifestyle here in Austin. And but that identity is carried, with them even as they retired. Now, if you happen to leave an organization prematurely and you didn't go through that cradle to grave process, excuse the term grave, but the uh, the identity shift that you encounter when you lose your job, or you've been fired maybe, or if you've elected to do something more aligned with who you may feel like you really are, when you step away from that big company and that identity and that daily ritual or role that you've been um, living, it's a shock. And if you look closely, at what's happening in your system is that your identity has shifted, and that's what gets really scary about change. Is often your self-perception as well as this collective experience, or this experience between you and the collective or the community and environment around you, which gives you a sense of purpose, belonging, and safety. So I noticed that, that identity by affiliation, that can be a blessing and it can also be a curse, because of course it depends on what you're identifying with as to and how it fits with your values and your the ultimate meaning that you're going to possibly derive from your life. So it's not I don't have one answer for everyone, but it's just something that I try to make note of in in the process of meeting and understanding people and seeing where they're at. And if they ask for some feedback or assistance or whatever, that affiliation is something that's very observable in a lot of people. It can give you a lot of insight as to how to reach others. And, the dangerous thing is when there's a super false identity operating rather than who they really are, you can kind of see the writing on the wall that there's at some point in time in their life, they may encounter kind of a crash, a realization that they've been living or kind of riding a wave that could could collapse, and they might have to face who they really are. There's a man that he approached me, I bet it was 8 or 9 years ago at the gym, and he was quite a bit older than me. I'd say probably 20 years older, and he admitted he was having a lot of trouble. This just happened at the gym between weights, and we kind of struck up an interesting conversation. He was a former FBI agent who had worked and kind of was in leadership position in San Francisco, and he had retired, but he'd been undercover. He'd worked on investigating and uncovering a lot of white collar crime. So he was part actor, part businessman, and ultimately part of the system, which was an interesting person for me to run into. And so I had a lot to learn from him and to examine in myself as we interacted with each other. As you may know, from just to give you a quick thumbnail, I'm an ex-athlete. I also do film acting and have used acting and psychology for personal development for a long time. And my father was in law enforcement, and I was exposed to many of the things that this guy, spoke about. And he'd also done a lot of international work. And since I've been an oil man and run workshops and had some oil interest all over the world, it's kind of given me an interesting perspective to share with someone like this. But the interesting thing that pulled and weighted the conversation down, and ultimately I think compromised our continuing to have a relationship, was that in one meeting at a coffee shop, we got to the bottom line that he was suffering from a large identity crisis. He was so wound up into who he had been in work and business, and he felt like whenever he stepped away from that identity, that suddenly he was in this void or in the abyss, and he couldn't connect to his wife or his children. And he was lost, and he was feeling things that were really suffering, or that he was really suffering with, and he didn't have the tools psychologically or emotionally or environmentally around him to allow him the sensitivity to deal with that vulnerability that he felt coming over him. So, and I was, 8 or 9 years ago, I was a little bit more, I was still putting all these pieces together. Today, I'd love to go back and touch base with him to see how that process has continued. But I just bring that up because a lot of people, as they're facing some of the changes that have occurred in our lifestyles, as lifespans have increased quite a bit over the past 20 to 30 years, as the transparency has become more of an operative factor in our daily lives, and the fact that a lot of people no longer have pre-planned retirements and benefits the way that they once did, when organizations were kind of built and maintained to provide a sense of full life support from cradle to grave. And so that's an adaptation that we're seeing across society. It's a place that we can reach out to people that, from a standpoint of really understanding from a consciousness standpoint about where people's needs really are, and to comfort them without forcing them back into some kind of, rigorous dogma that basically just takes the problem up from over here and puts a Band-Aid on it and lets them continue to operate until they die. I mean, who am I? That may be part of the bigger plan that needs to occur, because I don't have the outcome for every person or situation or group, but I tend to try to share a level of understanding that can facilitate outcomes that are really aligned with people's deeper meanings, if that's what they're here for. So I found that to be I wrote this statement here. Let me read it. It says, being a member of the group, assuming a false identity that's not yours, but making it your own, to find your place in the collective and live a pain-free and comfortable life. Maybe that's so until, as I've seen and heard, at the end, a lot of times everything does become clear. And that's the point that you realize whether you were living authentically or whether you were living a lie. And I think some of the pain of that, at least my fear, is that you're people that live an ultra comfortable life and don't face the discomfort of being human in their own life are basically setting the stage for future generations to need to deal with that. At some point, every habit, every addiction, every ritual, every dogma creates an escape from dealing with the real issues. And I just have this sense that maybe that's why I'm here, is to try to help us hold steady and understand that we do have the willpower. Like, I'm fasting on the 5th day right now, and I've done this for 4 years, to sustain some of the things that the collective says would be unhealthy or uncomfortable or impossible or crazy. Well, you be the judge if you like. So every community, every bubble operates with the sounds or with stereotypes. So this is part of one of the themes that's in some of the books that I've written, is that the environment has has its own existence. It's kind of like organic matter that we all comprise over the face of the earth. Well, the organic matter in a certain region kind of comes together collectively and energetically with a certain vibration and a certain tendency to like, if I walk into a certain place in Austin, it's a completely different experience than walking into Paris or London or New York. And I was shocked last time I was in New York. I was at an airport and I looked, and I mean, I'm 6'4", I'm taller than most, but I looked and there was a massive amount of people around me, and they were all shorter and much darker. And I really stood out as an albatross of being one of the few white men there. And I felt like everyone was looking at me as if I shouldn't be there or as if I was different. And I was different. And I could look around and I could see, of course, this is the way that I operate. I looked around and I saw a lot of people with a lot of differences beyond the stereotype that I just described. And, that was an experience that I've had over and over and over again that has kind of perplexed me until recently. And I realized that, just a fact. Every community does have its own certain set of biases and preferences and way of living. And that's true for what I have characterized as bubbles, that have like a commercial viability kind of baked into the way that they operate. And you have to adhere to those roles or rules to operate in that bubble. And there is some or some survival kind of baked into that allows people to survive in that bubble. And the operants are not necessarily fundamentally sound. They may be temporary, and they may have enough money or resources available in the community to sustain that bubble or whatever potential falsehoods or truths that are supporting that operation for, who knows how long. And, who am I to say? I think all these bubbles, whether it's Enron or, some religious dogma, that ends up playing out into an outcome that reveals, or maybe the Catholic Church, not being critical of the church, but just the faith that a lot of people had in those priests that at one period of time were systematically getting away with a lot of child abuse and rape and sexually molesting people. And, that cover up that lasted for years did a lot of damage. So there was a bubble there that was protected, and some of the technology that's emerged with the transparency in the last few years, movies, stories, people feeling comfortable enough to come out and make statements that in the face of the institutions that were making everyone feel a false sense of safety and keeping secrets, um, were divulged. So I think I'm here not just to help divulge those things, but to actually create a platform for us to have comfort and safety in emerging from those truths into a future that we build that's more fundamentally sound. And that's coming out in some of the books that I'm releasing, is that although it's a set of fictional books, they do create a narrative that could be used to kind of walk into a safer way of operating into the future. So, and I've gone out through my method acting time and, dyed my hair, assumed, a limp and, some of the classic actor techniques, and put those on in public, and even memorize lines, to say into the phone or to approach and kind of try out, just like Daniel Day-Lewis might in exploring one of his characters, um, to see how that feels. And it's amazing how, when you dye your hair or you put on a hat or you wear a different color of clothes, the shift I mean, if you're really watching and feeling and perceptive, you can tell that you're being treated differently. And even if you go outside as a woman, um, it can be a shocking experience versus being a man. And I'm not going to go a lot deeper into that right now because that's really not my point about the difference between sexuality in this um, bubble here in Austin versus other places. But there's a lot to explore there about um, the prejudices and biases and what people encounter in just a regular everyday setting at the grocery store, for example. The difference between being who I present myself as I do, today, versus if I dressed up as a lady, put on a wig and a dress, and walked in. Some people are just looking at everything on the surface, and they might take me as a female, and other people might see me as a man dressed up as a woman, and that could be an entirely different experience. Um, Another note here is art is now filled with more cleverness than humanity, and we have this intellectual mode um, that's often taken for brilliance or genius, or kind of like divinity. Like there's this, if a celebrity um, does something, it seems like there's a following that quickly assembles around whatever they're doing. And I'm noticing that a lot of the celebrity is around how clever or how smart or intellectual they are, which kind of goes along with a general theme in society of things getting more automated and patterned, and kind of almost like you have celebrities being stereotyped and cast into a certain um, dogmatic role that they embody in the kind of global consciousness. And it's funny, as an artist myself, or as someone that's an experimenter in consciousness and in life, um, acting at one point seemed like would be a great place to land because you could do these different roles. But what I see is most of the people that are quote unquote successful at that get typecast and locked into a particular role. And I know several people, who are actors that do that professionally, that either accept, or sometimes it creates um, a lot of pain for them because they really were looking for freedom, and they find that confining to have all their roles look exactly the same, even though they may move from one genre to the next, or working with one director or one group, to another. They're kind of doing the same old thing over and over again. So I'm glad I'm not part of that. Don't tell my agent that, but um, I don't say no, but I do find that when I've done, if I've auditioned for something a few months ago, and then they come back and they want me to read again for the part, and there's often all these delays in producing commercials and films and TV series. So when they come back, um, I'm kind of like, wonder, am I going to be the same person I was, 6 months ago when I did that audition, and am I really excited about doing that character or that role now? Because a lot of times I think some things happen for a purpose, and I've never really found that role that I wanted to do over and over and over again, and that's why we're here at Mark's Headroom, because obviously organically this is something that I'm comfortable with, and that's also why I do Future-Wise Energy and Transcendent. I find something in my soul that gets expressed, and between the writing and the filming and the production of it and distribution, it helps me a lot. So this is a very intimate process for me artistically, and I'm trying to find ways to bring what's in my soul forward and share it with others with dignity, and let it be available. So that's something that I find I actually, there's a memory that I have about an artist doing work that might be pushed under the bed and not even used in their lifetime. And they may die and it gets discovered, and wow, it's beautiful and it has an impact on others. And it's not for their sustenance during their lifetime, but rather for the impact that it'll ultimately had on others. And who am I to say? I mean, I'm not here to die and leave something behind, or to live and enjoy, the benefits of distribution of what I'm putting out there in the day. That's a bigger, it seems like a bigger choice, or a bigger operating factor than mine, um, than I can handle alone. And predetermining or making that an objective, a commercial objective, is not necessarily something that I do very well. And I've always been open to working with other people who might come in and help manage some of the delivery of some of the products that I create.